Hello everyone, this is Scott, and out here in a rainy Georgia day, we're under a severe weather alert. There's already a tornado watch being posted, probably flash flood and coming up in the near future. So anyhow, I've decided not to go out today and talk about one or two other items. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was today on the internet, there's lots of information out there. There's YouTube, which has, I think, over 1 billion subscribers. There's various news networks. There's a bunch of people like me doing video blogs and saying all sorts of things. Some of it's true, some of it's not. And I want to give you a little perspective on, finding the truth, because that's what we really want to do. And, just because you see it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. Now, a little bit of background with this is, before I retired from federal service, one of the jobs I did is I worked as an analyst. And I would often have to write white papers for people. And what a white paper is a 1 to 2 page summary of whatever the subject was that the person requesting the white paper wanted. The caveat to that is that these white papers typically are done in less than 8 hours, often less than 4 hours, and sometimes as quick as 1 hour. And so I had to write those. Now these white papers, that would go to my boss, or my boss's boss, or my boss's boss's boss, who would take them sometimes with them when they would go speak to members of Congress. And so it's not good to have false information in that white paper when your boss or boss's boss, etc., is speaking to a member of Congress. Whatever career you had up to that point would probably be done. So we had to be factual, we had to be fast, we had to be clear, we had to be concise. So that did not give a lot of time. So I wanted to give you some of the methodologies I used when vetting information. And it's important to do that because you want to be sure you're getting the truth, and not everything out there is truth. I see stuff all the time. So, the first thing you have to think of, or the first thing you should come across, is you should ask yourself, does it sound reasonable? Does this piece of information sound reasonable? A lot of times, if it's way out in the left or the right or whatever, it probably is, and it may not be totally factual. And I want to give a little anecdote. A comedian, George Carlin, some of you may know him, some of you may not. He's a rather funny guy. He did a little skit and went something like this. One day he's in his kitchen, he's going through his refrigerator, and he comes across a bowl of something he could not identify. So he takes it out and he looks at it, and he goes to his wife, "Honey, what's this stuff in the orange bowl?" And she says, "Smell it." Well, George Carlin looks at the bowl, picks up the saran wrap, gives it a smell, and goes, "It smells." He says, "It smells okay." So she calls back from the other room, "It's good. Put it back." So, that being said, does your information smell okay? And that's a good metaphor for this, because your nose is your last sensory device before you put something in your mouth. A lot of times you smell something bad, you'll stop, and that's a good indication there. Another thing I use is, can this video source be substantiated? And this is a tough one, and it takes a little work on your part, but it can be done. Let's say you go to a news article and it doesn't quite pass the first test. In other words, it's not reasonable, doesn't smell quite right. So some of the things you can do is, one, you can look at other news sources and see what they're saying. A lot of times if you go to a couple different news agencies, they'll tend to collaborate themselves, but you have to be careful here is that sometimes all these different news sources will use the same source for that information. In other words, it may be one reporter but 5 different news agencies or news services are using that one reporter's information, and that, if it's not relevant or if it's not reasonable or it's not truthful, that for that reporter, then all 5 of those news sources, can be wrong. So you got to be careful of that. But typically, if you go to 3 or 4 different news sources and they're all saying about the same thing, and they're using different news sources like their own reporters, there's some relevance there. There's some supporting documentation, so to speak. Another thing is, don't just rely on mainstream news services. Go to other places like Drudge or Anti-Media or whatever you like to use, and look at those and see what they're saying and see what they're quoting. In other words, you're trying to build up a level of reasonableness. In other words, if you could sit there and look at several different sources and they're all saying basically the same thing, it adds credence that whatever you're using, whatever information you're seeking, has some truth to it. Again, like I said, when I was doing this as an analyst, I had hours, and that included not only the research, but drafting and proofing that document before it went up. So yes, you have to be fast, and then if you do this enough, you get kind of a feel for certain things. But after a while, you'll learn, which sources are good and which aren't. And then maybe, if you're looking at a point of view, in other words, if an author is coming out and he's telling you that planet Nibiru is on the other side of the sun, it's going to hit here in November 17, 2021, and that's all he says, that may not be truthful. However, if he starts quoting sources, you want to look at those sources. Okay, why do you say this planet's going to crash into Earth in 2021? Well, if he starts quoting some scientific papers, people that have good credentials, okay, then there may be some truth. But planet Nibiru is going to come and crash and we're going to die, and okay, that's all, folks. If he can't identify his credentials and he can't identify any sources of people who have credentials to make that sort of statement, you've got to be careful. So, and this is the part that's bad about the internet, is you get somebody, just like I'm doing right now, coming out saying, whatever, and does not put any sources out there, and you take it for truth. Is it really true? I mean, in the long run, in a preparedness point of view, that could cost you your life if people are telling you to do something contrary to what you should really be doing. So as a prepper, as a survivalist, as somebody who just wants to stay informed, you need to be sure of your data before you take it and turn it into actionable items, because you may be doing the wrong action that may cost you more than just some lost time. I know somebody's going to bring up Wikipedia, and I use it. I think there's a lot of good in Wikipedia as well as a lot of bad. Again, when you're in Wikipedia, take a look at the article. Take a look at who's writing it. Take a look at what they're writing. Take a look at where they're getting their information from. One thing I like about Wikipedia is that they have searchable sources that usually at the bottom of the article where you can click and it brings you to the source document, and then you can evaluate that document as far as, is this article reasonable? And you can sit and say, well, yeah, it's backed by science. Here's a scientific paper on it. Here's a historical paper on it, and you can say, okay, this is reasonable. Whereas if it's linking you to another blog where somebody's just spouting off at the top of their head stuff, well, maybe not so. So Wikipedia can be good, but like everything else, use a little caution when you're using it, because it can be good, can be bad. But I do use Wiki. I use it quite a bit actually, but I look at their sources. If I'm in a real hurry, I won't check all 27 sources. I'll go through a couple enough to make me feel that the information's reasonable. And then before I go any further, and by the way, I have notes here that I'm looking at, so that's why I keep looking down. But I want to talk to you about reasonableness. Reasonableness, okay? Is your information reasonable? That's a very relative subject. And when you're working fast, you know, you're not looking for necessarily the exact cold hard facts. You're doing enough research where you feel reasonably sure that this information is good, and that level of reasonableness is valued on what your definition of reasonable is versus mine. Because I may have on some subjects, you know, I want to be very, very, very sure. Some other subjects, well, I just have to be mostly sure. And then some others, well, just kind of sure. And so you have to determine what is reasonable to you. And that's why in this particular case, I'm really not going to give a whole lot of examples, because what I consider reasonable and what you consider reasonable may be two different things. However, you're the one that's going to use your information, so you make that determination what is reasonable, what is not. And so, talking about that, I'll give you a little story that I had. When I was working for an agency or company that was providing intelligence for the Cajun Navy relief effort up in Lumberton, North Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina during Hurricane Florence, they brought me on as a staff weather officer, and part of my job was to provide weather, accurate weather, to them so that they could make decisions on where they were going to pre-stage, where they were going to stage, and then where they were going to perform rescues. And so my data had to be good. I pulled in data from many different sources, from many different government agencies, and put together a report. We also had collectors out there, people who would collect information and send it to us. We had people watching Twitter. We had people watching Facebook. We had people watching chat rooms. We had people on scanners. We were just getting this constant input of information. Of course, not all of it's true. And at one point, in about the middle of the operation, somebody reposted a tweet that said, "Dam broke. Mayor says run for your life." And that was it. And so I looked at all my stuff, all the data points I was collecting, and I didn't see that. So I started asking, where is this dam? Where is this water? Where is this? And another tweet came in, 20-foot wall of water heading for the city. And I started to query the collectors on this, and nobody can give me an answer of where this dam was, where this wall of water was. Where we were, in the area we were in, there was no dam break. And so after about 45 minutes of this, like a little child, I would put this little thing to bed, and a couple hours later it would wake up, and then somebody would say, "Oh, wall of water, dam broke," same thing. This happened 2 or 3 times. I eventually just called it the dam, because it was a pain. And then another thing while we're talking about it, is when you're evaluating information, is the person qualified to comment on the information? Again, be reasonable. A man or woman doesn't necessarily have to have an advanced degree on a particular subject. However, they should have a bio available, and the bio should support what they're saying. What makes them an expert on this subject for them to make the wild claims they're making? A lot of times, it's just somebody out there on a video YouTube saying something or anything that they heard somebody else say, but nobody is checking this information and whether it's valid or not. So you should have a person, and you should know in what way they're qualified to make the statements they're making. And a couple words of caution I have is, one, is the person operating under a pseudonym? And that's kind of important when you're evaluating information, because if they're operating under a pseudonym, you don't know who they are. And if you don't know who they are, then how can you qualify them as an expert? So, it gets a little sketchy. And I want to stop here saying, if you're watching this video on YouTube, if you've got an email account, if you've got a credit card, if you've got a bank account, if you've got a cell phone, they got your information. They got a picture of you. They know how much money you've got in the bank. A pseudonym will no longer help you. And so that's why I don't see why people hide behind the scene. I hear people all the time, well, I'm not going to show my face on the internet, or I'm not going to show my face on this podcast, and I'm operating under a pseudonym for operational security. You throw that out the window. If you're on here, you have no expectation of privacy. So that being said, if the person that's giving you this information, do they have a bio? Do they have a biography that explains why they're qualified? And that's important, because if they're giving you an opinion and they're giving you information that's critical to your survival, and they're not giving you sources, okay, that's a caution right there. Number two, if they're hiding behind a pseudonym, that always makes me suspicious. And if they're not giving sources and they're hiding under a pseudonym, and they don't give you a bio, then you have absolutely no idea who you're talking to, and for all you know, it could be some 14-year-old operating out of their mother's basement. So how good can that data be? So vet your stuff, look at it, make sure, does it sound reasonable? Does the person sound reasonable? Are they reasonably qualified? So you got to look at this stuff, and it doesn't take long, but you have to look at it. And just because some guy is ranting and raving that we're all going to die in 3 years because of a planet that's behind the sun is going to swing around and crash into us, exercise that. And then I want to talk about websites. My goodness, there are so many websites out there. Everybody's got them. Everybody's talking about everything, everywhere, anyhow. But it goes back. Are they qualified? Is the website geared for that sort of thing? One of the things that I use as a indicator of the relevance of the information or reliability of the information is the website loaded with advertisements? I mean, you have the sidebars that they're all filled across the top. They're wanting you to buy something. They're doing all sorts of gear reviews. You gotta sit there and look at that. Are they, when money gets involved, when you start talking about money and you start monetizing things, money kind of creates a warp field around information, and it kind of distorts the reality sometimes. I think you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that money will influence people, maybe not in the best way, in order for them to sell more stuff. So be careful when you're in a website that's over monetized, has all sorts of advertisements, because maybe they're just saying things to get you to buy more. But again, that's something you have to talk about. Also, too, the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. Ask those questions. Answer them. you know, and that'll help you. And like I said, this is just a quick notes version of looking at information, and you should be looking at this to determine, because if you're making your plans and the guy that's telling you this stuff is not overly qualified, you know, maybe he slept in a Holiday Inn Express or something, but be careful, because it's dangerous when you put your life and your family's life in the hands of someone you don't know. So be careful out there. Be safe. If you can stay out of weather like this, stay out of it. We'll talk to you later. Bye.